Mr. Speaker, I thank the members for their queries, suggestions, and unanimous support for the bill. Let me first address members' queries on the three key features of the proposed licensing regime. First, Mr. Gantiampo expressed his support for LTA's management of the size of each operator's fleet by setting a maximum fleet size. LTA will review the fleet sizes regularly. Operators who manage their fleet well can apply to LTA to grow their fleets. This will ensure that they grow their fleet sizes in a more sustainable manner and are incentivized to put in place measures to manage the indiscriminate parking as they grow their fleet. LTA will use a bottom-up approach and consider each application on its own merits. This is because the fleet size needs to take into account how well each operator manages his business to maximize utilization and minimize these amenities. With LTA managing the fleet size of each operator, operators will be incentivized to deploy their limited fleet wisely, instead of flooding public bicycle spaces with unused shared bicycles. LTA will also monitor the situation and, if necessary, step up the expansion of bicycle infrastructure. Second, LTA will be able to impose license conditions as well as set industry-wide standards to address indiscriminate parking. With regard to Dr. Teo Ho Pin's suggestion on the penalty framework for licensees, we will look into it as LTA works out the implementation details of the licensing regime. We would also like to assure Dr. Teo and Dr. Intan that LTA will take strong action against repeated or serious infringements of license requirements, including revocation of the operator's license. Mr. Faisal Manap asked about the data requirements under the new Section 8K. Section 8K imposes obligations on operators to keep accounts and records and to provide information to LTA. This can include data on the location of each deployed vehicle so that LTA can track indiscriminate parking and enforce more effectively by leveraging on data and technology. LTA will put in place safeguards to protect the information, including implementing controls to limit access to the database. To ensure that dockless bicycle sharing remains attractive to users and to prevent indiscriminate parking, several members spoke about the importance of adequate parking, and I agree. While it is not possible for us to always have parking at our doorsteps, we are striving to have parking spaces available within a short walk of most households and key destinations. Currently, there are over 170,000 bicycle parking spaces, which are well distributed across Singapore. More than 99% of public homes and 90% of private homes are within a 5-minute walk from bicycle parking. There are also public bicycle parking areas close to more than 80% of key destinations, such as polyclinics, community centers, schools, and town centers. We'll continue to work with HDB, town councils, and other public agencies to provide more parking spaces where there is demand. 50,000 bicycle parking spaces will be added by 2020 at MRT stations, HDB estates, and parks. To address Ms. Jones Pereira's suggestion of sheltered bicycle parking, we will try to locate bicycle parking spaces within sheltered areas as far as possible. However, this may not always be possible in areas with site constraints. Ms. Jones Pereira will also be pleased to know that in industrial estates and business parks, JTC has already designated more than 50 parking zones for shared bicycles. LTA will continue to work with JTC to implement more parking spaces in industrial areas. The data that the operators provide to LTA on the distribution of shared bicycles will also help us better plan parking provision, including providing more bicycle parking spaces at areas with high demand. I share Ms. Tanalakshmi's view that the provision of shared device parking in private developments would improve convenience for the tenants and visitors. LTA is working with the operators to have them reach out to condominium managements foreign worker dormitory operators, and commercial buildings to allow for the parking of shared devices within these developments. However, the decision to allow shared devices to be parked within the premises ultimately rests with the private developer. QR codes will be installed at all public parking spaces at MRT stations, bus stops, parks, and HDB estates. I would like to assure Ms. Joan Pereira that these parking spaces will continue to be open to all privately owned and shared bicycles. Private users can continue to park their bicycles at these spaces as they currently do today, and operators do not have to rent these parking spaces. Allowing shared bicycles to be parked at public parking places benefits members of the public who use these services. Ms. Joan Pereira also asked about how QR code-enabled geofencing will work and whether its potential downsides can be mitigated. QR codes complement the accuracy of GPS-based geofencing. Safeguards will be put in place to reasonably ensure that the scanning of static QR code geofencing cannot be gamed. Each parking location will have a unique QR code, and users will only be allowed to end their trip if the scanned QR code matches the GPS location of the parking location. For example, if users take a photo of the QR code or use it to park anywhere outside its specified location, they will not be able to end their trip because the QR code does not match with the GPS location of the shared bicycle. Where a QR code has been vandalized, users will still be allowed to end their trip if they take a photograph of the bicycle parked within the bicycle parking area and submit it within the operator's application. LTA will also act promptly to replace QR codes which have been damaged. At the same time, LTA will continue to study other ways of geofencing to strengthen our capabilities to pinpoint the location of shared bicycles. Third, Ms. Joan Pereira, Mr. Gantiampo, and Dr. Intan spoke about the measures which will be put in place to engender greater user responsibility. I would like to clarify with Dr. Intan that under the Memorandum of Understanding with existing bike-sharing operators, LTA has worked with the operators to implement GPS-enabled geofencing and geotag bicycle parking spaces in their mobile applications. With this function, users can plan ahead for where to park before they start their journey. Despite this, there are still irresponsible users who choose to park indiscriminately. Hence, it is necessary to take firmer steps to deter irresponsible user behavior. We will do so through the collective ban. Users will also not be allowed to end their trips with the operators until the bicycles are parked within designated parking areas. In other words, irresponsible users who park indiscriminately will continue to be charged until they park properly. Mr. Gantiampo suggested that the government hold users accountable for improper parking instead of relying on operators to do so. Under the Streets Works Act, LTA can fine users who are identified as parking improperly. However, it is also often difficult to catch users red-handed. As operators can track the whereabouts of the bicycles, they are better placed to detect and prevent indiscriminate parking from occurring in the first place. Nevertheless, LTA will continue to see how we can better enforce against improper parking under the Street Works Act, including using information from the operators to identify hotspots for enforcement. Mr. Gantiampo also suggested differentiating the fine amounts for individuals based on age and income. It is not possible to do so as the law has to be fair to all individuals who have committed the same offense. Ms. Joan Pereira suggested imposing a fines on users who are caught using someone else's identity to rent a bicycle when they have been banned, while Dr. Intan suggested compulsory community work for repeat offenders. We will study these suggestions. Ms. Thanalakshmi asked if LTA could consider waiving the financial penalties for operators who have done their due diligence to discourage users from parking indiscriminately. I would like to clarify that operators will not be penalized if their users park indiscriminately. Users will be penalized for parking indiscriminately through the collective ban, through geofencing if users do not return their vehicle to a proper parking area. They will not be able to end their trip and will continue to be charged by the operators. However, LTA will take regulatory action against the operators if they do not remove the indiscriminately parked vehicles in a timely manner, and if they do not comply with other license conditions such as implementing the collective ban. To address Dr. Intan's query on enforcement resources, we will use data and technology to enforce more efficiently. We will also cross-deploy enforcement officers where possible to balance between sufficient enforcement presence on the ground for deterrence, as well as the need for prudence and efficiency. Mr. Ang Wei Neng asked about the recovering from the operators the cost of the licensing regime, including the cost of providing yellow boxes and QR codes. We have invested in providing bicycle parking spaces to support active mobility and our car-like vision. Hence, we do not intend to charge operators for rental or surface-level bicycle parking spaces, and will continue to allow residents who use both private and shared devices to use these spaces. Under the licensing regime, LTA can require the operators to provide additional parking spaces if needed. As far as possible, we intend to recover the cost of the licensing regime through license fees. Ms. Thanalakshmi cautioned that the licensing regime should not result in high barriers to entry and innovation. We do not intend for the licensing regime to be unduly onerous for the operators. However, the licensing requirements are costs which should be internalized by the operators in the course of their business, as they reflect the social disamenities, costs, and efforts needed to address them. To reduce barriers to entry for new operators and encourage innovation, we are considering implementing a regulatory sandbox for new operators with no track record. We recognize that new operators could benefit from a trial phase as they scale up their operations and learn how to manage their fleet responsibly. They would be granted a much smaller fleet and subject to a subset of the full license requirements. LTA will monitor their performance closely before determining whether to grant them a full license. We agree with Mr. Henry Kwek that it is important that our regulations evolve to keep up with public behavior as well as new technology and business models. The proposed licensing regime was developed based on feedback on indiscriminate parking from members of the public, LTA's engagement with stakeholders and interest groups, and the passionate debates we have had here in Parliament. We will continue to track the situation and engage the public and operators to review the effectiveness of these regulations. Where necessary, we can also update the licensing conditions to better address indiscriminate bicycle parking. Some members have also raised other issues which lies outside the scope of this bill. I would like to reiterate that the proposed licensing regime under the Parking Places Act aims to address indiscriminate parking. It is not intended to address issues unrelated to parking, such as reckless riding behavior and cycling paths improvements, which was raised by Dr. Teo Ho Pin, and maintenance standards and liability issues in the event of accidents, which was raised by Mr. Faisal Manap. However, I understand these are useful and pertinent suggestions, and the Active Mobility Advisory Panel will be reviewing the active mobility rules to address reckless riding. Maintenance standards and liability issues are covered under the MOU with the operators, and all bicycle sharing operators under the MOU have purchased insurance for riders and third parties. With regard to Dr. Intan's query, the licensing regime is for dockless vehicle sharing operators and will not cover privately owned vehicles and devices. To address indiscriminate parking of privately owned bicycles, we will continue to provide more parking spaces and step up enforcement where necessary. Next, on the parking provision requirements. I would like to assure Ms. Thanalakshmi that when determining the parking provision standards, LTA will take into account all relevant factors, including the development's proximity to public transport network and first and last mile connectivity. Developments within 400 meters of an MRT station, for example, are considered to be well connected via public transport. For areas which are more than 400 meters away from an MRT station, there is already an extensive feeder bus network to provide first and last mile connectivity. Ms. Thanalakshmi also asked about the impact of the new parking provisions on parking charges. Private parking charges are determined by the market and may vary based on the specific parking demand, parking availability, and building owners' parking management considerations. As for HDB and URA's parking charges, HDB and URA takes into account relevant factors such as the cost of providing car parks when setting car park charges at a reasonable level. Mr. Ang Wei Neng asked a few questions about how we will implement the new parking standards. I would like to clarify that the bill will allow LTA to prescribe the range of parking lots which private developers have to provide, defined by a lower and/or upper limit. This will apply only to new developments, as well as existing developments undergoing redevelopment and major additions and alteration works. For existing developments undergoing redevelopment or major A&A works, LTA will work closely with URA to implement the new parking standards and to ensure that our limited land resources are put to good use. With regard to Dr. Intan's suggestion on provision of parking spaces for dispatch riders, LTA will study its feasibility. Mr. Speaker, these amendments to our parking provision standards are timely and necessary. Since our last review of car parking provision requirements, there has been significant expansion of the public transport network and enhancement in first last mile connectivity. The amendments in the bill will give LTA a wider range of tools to better calibrate parking provision requirements for private developments. In summary, Mr. Speaker, this bill seeks to support car-like initiatives in a sustainable and responsible manner. So I'm confident the proposed licensing regime will address the problem of indiscriminate parking and allow sharing operations to meet commuters' needs in a more sustainable manner. The amendments to vehicle parking provision will enable us to calibrate vehicle parking more precisely so that we can maximize the use of limited land in Singapore. With that, Mr. Speaker, I beg to move.